Welcome back, guys, to the JPS Education Portal Roundtable. You are here with myself, Martin, and Mackenzie, and this month's topic is hypertrophy. So, Martin, this is right up your alley. You're currently doing a PhD on a specific topic related to this area. So, kick us off with, I guess, the physiology of how muscle grows. Give the guys a breakdown of what's involved when we want to get jacked.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it's probably a good idea to first define the term hypertrophy, because it's not just relevant to muscle. So hypertrophy in physiology refers to the enlargement of a cell, generally due to the increase in its contents. And so the cell gets larger, and therefore the tissue will also get larger. So in our context, we're speaking about skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So skeletal muscle being that contractile tissue that we obviously use when we are resistance training. And hypertrophy is referring to the increase in the size of muscle cells or muscle fibers. So muscle cells, muscle fibers, those terms can be used interchangeably. It's these muscle fibers that make up skeletal muscle tissue, right? And there are thousands and thousands of muscle fibers in a given volume of muscle tissue, and they all experience hypertrophy on an individual level. So they all experience tension somewhat individually, and they subsequently grow in response to that mechanical tension, which comes from resistance training. So the basic physiology of hypertrophy can be summarized in probably four different levels. There's obviously genetic processes right at the bottom that kickstart all the chemical signaling cascades that are required for a cell to get larger. So it all starts on the level of the genes, and that highlights the importance of genetic variability between individuals and how that can lead to variation in one's potential to build muscle. It really all does start there. After that, we have we need a stimulus, right? So stimulus comes after that, and the stimulus mainly is mechanical tension. Again, mechanical tension coming from resistance training. That's referring to the internal force that each of those muscle fibers are producing in response to the external load. So we're trying to overcome an external load. Muscle fibers have to produce force. And so tension is transmitted across the muscle fibers. And that is the stimulus on a very basic level. And that can be modulated with specific training variables. And that stimulus has a molecular and eventually a cellular effect. And what I mean by this is the stimulus affects the cell's physiology on a molecular level, and this leads to increases in muscle protein synthesis. That's a term that we generally hear get used in these discussions, and that term is referring to an increase in the amount of amino acids being converted or built up or synthesized into proteins. And skeletal muscle, contractile tissue, and it's contractile tissue because it's made up of proteins that are capable of contracting. And when we combine that resistance training stimulus with sufficient protein ingestion and obviously sufficient amino acids as a function of that, we achieve enough muscle protein synthesis over time to lead to those cellular changes that I mentioned earlier. And the cellular changes would be the cell actually getting larger. So it can get longer. The muscle cells can get longer, and as a function of that, there's more volume, right? So they are kind of getting bigger because they're getting longer, but they can also get wider and thicker as well. So that's the last step. That would be the cellular changes, and they would only take place if muscle protein synthesis is exceeding muscle protein breakdown over time. So that's the key point. The key point is that resistance training combined with amino acid ingestion leads to muscle protein synthesis, upregulation, but that has to be sufficient enough and great enough over time to exceed the corresponding breakdown that also occurs in between protein feedings and so on. So that's what hypertrophy is. That's the basic physiology behind it. And for our purposes, I think that'll set up the conversation well.
Yeah, perfect. And I think there's a number of things that we need to circle back in terms of, I guess, the tension stimulus, because that is the primary factor that we can control. Our genetics are somewhat dictated, and then obviously nutrition comes into play, which Mackenzie will turn to you now. So Martin obviously mentioned amino acids and protein intake. What are the big rocks for nutrition when it comes to muscle growth? Do you want to lay the law there?
Absolutely. And first thing I'll say is that I'm an expert in skeletal muscle hypertrophy, as you can see. So more than well qualified to discuss this topic, clearly. So what are we talking about? Nutrition big rocks. So we want to create a positive net protein balance. That's where muscle protein synthesis exceeds muscle protein breakdown. Now, as Mark discussed, there are various inputs that contribute to that. But from a nutrition perspective, the primary one is going to be amino acid ingestion. In other words, eating protein, right? We also have a contributing factor from other variables, in particular, calorie intake or energy balance. Now, and this is the idea of, okay, when we want to gain muscle, we want to be eating an appropriate amount of protein. And if we really want to hone in on protein nutrition best practice, we also want to be distributing that across our waking hours in a certain way that, maximizes muscle protein synthetic rate, or muscle protein synthesis rather, across the day. In terms of the caloric surplus thing, as I mentioned or alluded to before, this is something that also drives muscle protein synthesis. But whether it's needed to create a net positive protein balance where that muscle protein synthesis exceeds breakdown over a period of time is something that is context dependent. It's a bit of an it depends thing. And I am not on board. What I'll say is that the idea of you must be in a calorie surplus to gain muscle as a blanket statement is not evidence-based, at least in my view.
All right, Marty, over to you. Obviously, yeah, there's a few things to unpack there. And I would say I agree that it is context dependent. And there's obviously situations such as if you have a rank beginner who's training, an energy surplus is probably not necessary for them to build muscle, just like oftentimes with obese individuals or people returning from a layoff or our friends on Mexican supplements. So there are certainly situations where muscle growth can occur independent of an energy surplus. Marto, is there anything that you want to add to Mac's statements?
Yeah, I do agree. I think there's a difference between what is optimal and what is going to get the job done effectively enough for most of our clients. So yes, a calorie surplus as a blanket statement, a calorie surplus is required for muscle hypertrophy. We know that's not an accurate claim. There is a lot of research that shows hypertrophy can occur in an energy deficit and in certain situations, as you alluded to, Jacob. But as an individual gets more advanced, I think that the need for a calorie surplus probably starts to increase, especially if they want to get as much possible out of their training experience. And that's where, working with clients and understanding that intricate balance between what's theoretically optimal, what's realistically achievable, understanding how to work within that balance is really important. Some clients don't want to maximize muscle hypertrophy, and so they may not need to be in a surplus for extended periods. But if we're speaking about physique athletes, aspiring bodybuilders, for example, the need for a calorie surplus in that demographic is probably going to increase. The next question generally is, well, how large does the calorie surplus need to be? So maybe that's the next step we can take. Mackenzie, did you want to touch on that? If someone did want to maximize muscle growth, how many calories do they need to eat in surplus?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and definitely going to echo what you say is once you sort of edge into more of that intermediate, advanced training age and experience, the sensitivity of um, training and protein nutrition alone might not be enough to create that net positive protein balance over time, and that's when the calorie surplus is that needed boost to move you into that range consistently. Another aspect, though, actually, that I did forget to mention, and I do apologize, is the effect of nutrition on training performance. And as we've spoken about already, training performance or training is the stimulus to the adaptation. Okay, it's the thing that initiates what we want, which is the muscle growth. So if nutrition is supporting training performance, or nutrition can play a role in boosting training performance, so you can really maximize that stimulus and therefore maximize the adaptation. So back to what you were saying there, Marto, about how much of a calorie surplus should we be in? Now, this one is a bit difficult. There's actually quite a lot of moving targets. When we think about the energy in muscle, we think logically, okay, well, we've got to get that energy from somewhere. Therefore, we need to get that from food. That is true, but at the same time, we do have stored energy within our bodies that we can tap into if we need. But we also have other reasons beyond that why we would want additional calories. And this can include things such as increased energy expenditure because we're training. It can be increased non-exercise activity. It can be just an increase in the thermic effect of feeding, for example. So through the process of synthesizing new muscle tissue or building muscle, however you want to say it, that comes at an energy cost as well, that actual process. And then also digesting and absorbing and just kind of managing the food that we eat. So there's numerous reasons why we would want to eat more food if the goal was to maximize muscle growth. Now, the size of that surplus is a tricky one for those reasons, but also because it seems that there is a bit of a sweet spot where more calories and therefore more weight gain does not equal more muscle gain, but it incrementally equals more relative fat gain. So if let's lay out, say, a 9-month phase, we're going to go for muscle growth. We want to do everything we can. We're going to dot our I's and cross our T's. Okay, we're going to be in a surplus. Now, there is a point where additional calories does not give you more muscle, and you're just going to, frankly, get fatter. Okay, and this is undesirable for numerous reasons: body composition, performance, but also health as well. So the actual size of that surplus is going to be individual. I've heard things like, any amount of surplus that gains you 1% to 2% of body weight per month for your typically more advanced level lifters is the way to go. And the size of that surplus is going to vary. Other research suggests anywhere from around 360 to 480 calories per day or kilocalories per day in excess of maintenance. It's all a little bit questionable. And I think the best way to do it from my perspective is to assess body weight trends over time, look at other factors such as training performance, and then make a pragmatic, informed decision as to whether calories should be increased, remain constant, or reduced down if excessive body fat is being gained.
Yeah, that pretty much echoes most of my thoughts on that. The recommendation we give at JPS is around 300, 500 calorie surplus, which Mackenzie, that was pretty much in line with what you said there. And anywhere from like 0.5 to 2% of body weight gain per month. Obviously, depending on how lean the individual is to begin with and their potential for muscle growth at that point in time. Marto, anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just highlighting the importance of what Mackenzie said towards the end of his statement there, where he said it's probably a good idea to work with an individual and track body weight changes over time and use those percentages instead of just using a given number and attaching yourself to that. We know that people will compensate or upon overeating. We know that people can offset those calories by experiencing an increase in their total daily energy expenditure. That varies across individuals. So, if all three of us ate 500 calories in excess of our maintenance, in a week or two, that 500 calorie surplus would maybe no longer be a 500 calorie surplus for me, but it could be for you guys. It's going to change as the days and the weeks go by and as the body's physiology adapts. So yeah, I think in practice, it's all well and good to give recommendations in theory based off research, but in practice, monitoring an individual's weight gain closely and then making adaptive changes based on percentage rate of gain each month or whatever it may be is important.
Yeah, and that ties in a couple of really important points to discuss. So we've obviously looked at the nutrition, the rate of weight gain, and the size of the surplus to sort of optimize hypertrophy. But one of the key factors there, as we've mentioned, is training performance. So let's turn to, I guess, training. Mackenzie, you're going to have to just, you can mute yourself as well as blank your screen for the next 20 minutes while me and Martin discuss this. I'm joking, Mackenzie, don't get upset. But training is very important because the stimulus is what drives hypertrophy. So we obviously know that there are a number of training variables. Well, we hope the listeners of the portal know what the variables are. We've got volume, frequency, intensity, exercise selection, rest periods, and tempo. Now, these all have a role in muscle growth, but some are a little bit more important when it comes to providing the muscle with the tension stimulus. Marto, so do you want to discuss these variables as they relate to mechanical tension?
Yeah, so like you said, they all play a role. So they all need to be considered in the overall program design, but there are definitely some that likely have a larger influence on the mechanical tension stimulus than others. So if we start from the top, I think when writing a program, it's usually a good idea to base decisions off the exercises that you're prescribing, because that's going to make up the structure, the theme of the program. So the exercise will influence the muscle groups being trained and the way the tension is being directed across the musculature. And whenever you're discussing exercise selection, exercise execution comes along with that, because whenever we prescribe exercise to clients and coach clients, and whenever we perform exercise ourselves, it's a good idea to be trying to implement a quote unquote good technique, right? What is a good technique? That's probably a discussion for another day, but there's certain factors that we can look out for in an individual's technique that would make it good for hypertrophy. The range of motion, whether or not the exercise, the biomechanics of the exercise suit the individual, the stability demands of an exercise, your ability to just practically track the progression of the exercise from week to week and to load it, heavier and heavier potentially from week to week as well. So there's a few things going on there, but that's where we start. We start with the exercise because, like I said, that's influencing the way the tension is being directed across the musculature, and the way the exercise is executed is obviously of primary importance there as well. Now, once you've selected, your exercises for a given training program, you're then going to move on to volume allocation, right? How much volume, how much of a dose do I want to be providing the client here, or myself, or whoever you're programming for? So the way I like to think about it is systematically. We've got the exercise, then we choose the amount of volume that we're going to allocate to that given exercise. That's going to dictate our total training dose. And when I say volume, I'm using the term. I'm thinking of volume as set volume, so the number of sets that are being performed for a given muscle group per week. That's our dose of the stimulus. And then you're going to decide, well, how hard should I actually be pushing these sets, right? And this is where it's important to realize that mechanical tension, right, it's obviously being influenced by the way the exercise is being executed, but it's also being influenced by the magnitude of tension that is being experienced per repetition, and also the duration of that tension, right? So how many reps are actually being performed. Now, on a very basic level, if you're using a heavier load and you're lifting a heavier load per repetition, the magnitude of that tension stimulus is going to be higher. And we have some reason to believe that as we get closer to the end of the set, as a function of more motor unit recruitment, the magnitude of tension may also be higher. So we have to consider that. And proximity to failure clearly plays a large role in influencing the magnitude of tension. So, with a given load, pushing closer to failure is likely going to increase mechanical tension. Whether or not that's linear is questionable. And we have to think about the carry-on effects of that too. But we've got the magnitude of tension, which is being influenced by the load lifted, proximity to failure, and then the volume, right? So set volume, that's going to influence the total dose of tension, so the total duration of tension that we experience across a workout. So really, at this point, you can see how it's almost a balancing act. More volume, right, for a given muscle group means you probably don't have to push as close to failure. Whether or not that's practically the best approach for some clients is questionable. Some clients maybe yes, others may be better off with a lower volume, closer proximity to failure approach. The end result, might be similar if it's executed quite well. We don't really know exactly how that would play out. I think in most cases, starting off with a lower volume approach, pushing closer to failure works really well. And then you can increase volume over time on an as needs basis. And then, finally, you've got, frequency. So how often am I going to expose the musculature to the tension stimulus? Again, a higher volume approach may need slightly more frequency because within a session, it's likely a good idea to have a cap on the amount of volume you're completing. So, up to 10 sets, probably okay. Beyond 10 sets for a given muscle group in a certain session, starting to maybe become a little detrimental to the overall tension stimulus. So something to be keeping in mind there. But that's obviously individual dependent because we all experience fatigue differently. And that needs to be considered because what we're trying to do here really is we're trying to maximize the stimulus of training whilst limiting the fatigue costs, because the fatigue itself can directly influence a muscle's ability to produce force and therefore the mechanical tension that it also experiences. So again, it's that balancing act. It's using these variables to create a program that provides a sufficient stimulus. So do we have enough volume? Are we pushing close enough to failure? Are we selecting the right exercises for our clients and are they being performed well? Spreading that out, somewhat evenly across the week. For the most part, that's a good recommendation. And then finding ways to limit fatigue by, making sure individuals are resting sufficiently between sets, between workouts, making sure volume allocations aren't exceeding their recovery capacity, etc. So hopefully that gives a broad overview of how the training variables may influence the tension stimulus.
Yeah, it does. And I think an important note there is, although the exercise selection is important for muscle growth, hypertrophy, it can occur independent of the exercise performed. So, a lot of people build muscle riding a bike, running, doing all sorts of activities because they're producing force. And I guess that's a critical point to understand, because once you understand that hypertrophy is all about the tension stimulus and then making sure you're getting the right dose and magnitude, you can see why resistance training is probably the best option for providing the muscles with that tension, and then why the volume and exercise become important for then how much and where we're putting that tension. So that's a really good foundation for that. And I guess the next point of discussion I wanted to bring up, as this is a very general roundtable, is how we measure muscle growth. So if we know for nutrition, we need a surplus, sufficient amino acids and proteins split up over the day. We need to look at the training variables. How do we measure muscle growth and know that we are actually getting more jacked? Because that's one of the biggest challenges I see a lot of people face, because it is a very forgiving adaptation and very hard to measure. It's not like a 1 rep max on a squat where you've gotten stronger or not. It's quite difficult to assess muscle growth practically and inexpensively anyway. So Mackenzie, do you want to kick us off for how we measure muscle growth in a pragmatic sense?
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing because even the gold standard ways of measuring muscle mass, or lean mass at least, directly have a level of measurement error. And muscle growth is such a slow incremental thing over a span of time that it might even be less than that measurement error of these gold standard measurement techniques. So we might be thought to believe that we haven't gained any muscle or even lost muscle when we have actually in reality gained muscle tissue, but due to the measurement error, we've been misled here. And that's, again, if we're using these gold standard techniques, which can be expensive, they can be annoying and practical. So how do we measure muscle growth then? Now, I mean, I'm not a coach in a gym. I don't write training programs. I look at it from a nutrition perspective. I typically look at body weight trends over time, but I will also consider things like training performance. Because I think that improvements in training performance can be a pretty solid indicator of whether muscle mass has increased or not. And obviously there is a skill acquisition component, among other things that might result in improvements in performance independent to muscle growth. But there is also increased muscle size. We're going to see increased performance. And again, we could open a debate on, what's the chicken and egg situation here, which comes first. I'm not going to get into that. All I'm going to say is that if I'm looking at a client, I'm going to consider these things first and foremost. But other factors to consider are honestly how they're feeling. Their appetite, I think, plays a role. Things like sleep and energy levels can play a role. Like if they don't have if their sleep is good, but their energy levels, their perception of energy is not great, then this is an indication of maybe they need more food. So it's really a lot of different things, but I would say the crux of it is trying to take a pragmatic conclusion or applying pragmatism to the two key factors being training performance and body weight trends over time. They're the first things that I would personally probably look at.
Yeah, awesome. Marta, over to you.
Yeah, I think that was a great practical thought process. I think the one thing we can add on top of that is visual progress photos. Beyond the visual progress shots, the body weight measurements and maybe circumference measurements that come along with that, and then performance metrics. In the gym, on the gym floor, there's really not much more you can do. Like Mackenzie said, there are other means of measuring lean mass. Maybe an individual can get a DEXA scan, but Mackenzie also mentioned there are limitations to that. I'm not opposed to clients getting DEXA scans, but as long as they understand the limitations, that's the main thing. When it comes to performance, I think it's worthwhile diving a bit deeper into that. So, what type of increases in performance are actually going to lead to hypertrophy? Is an increased 1RM going to lead to more hypertrophy? Maybe not as much as an individual being able to do, 3 sets of 10 with a really heavy load and hitting what we might call a volume PB. So this comes down to tracking volume load. Probably a good idea to measure volume load, which is sets times reps times load in a program, and track it over time for a given exercise. Isolation exercises are really good because they're obviously very directed and there's less noise. So there's less tissue contributing to the lift, which makes muscle growth inferences probably a bit more accurate. So if we're
Also
making inferences less technical as well. So I think a volume load measurement over time for most exercises, if it's over a long time span, we're talking 6 to 12 months here, is a good indication that something is happening and that muscle is being built if the other factors we discussed are also trending in the right direction. So if we have body weight slowly creeping up, circumference measurements may be increasing, and visual photos also looking quite positive. It's just that on some exercises like isolation exercises, there may be more of a direct kind of influence on hypertrophy. So volume load over time, that's a little bit different to just measuring increases in set volume, for example. So probably an important distinction to be made. It increases in volume load over time on a given exercise are due to some adaptations that have taken place. For our context today, we're assuming that some of those adaptations have been morphological, so they've come from hypertrophy. Yes, there may be some neural adaptations there too, probably a combination of both, which is why we can make that inference in the long run. But adding sets, from week to week or within a session, that is an increase in volume, but it's an acute increase in volume. So it's a little different to experiencing somewhat of an organic increase in volume load due to prior adaptations, right? So due to getting bigger and stronger. So something to keep in mind there when trying to assess hypertrophy via performance. And like I said, if you've got that heading in the right direction, across most exercises in a program over time, and body weight's slowly increasing along with circumference measures and visual shots are looking good, then you're probably building muscle, and you've got to somewhat trust in your abilities as a coach, your ability to write a good training program, and as long as the client is adhering and executing well, that's the most important thing, really. Then you'd be on the right track.
Yeah, and that's something that we discuss a lot at our seminars, and most of our conversations relating to muscle growth is the distinction between acute volume versus like chronic volume, and the two lenses you need to look at volume through. So set volume, if you're adding sets, which a lot of people have become really hell bent on, how many sets should I do? If I'm, not growing, do I add more sets? That's a form of progression. That's just doing more work. That's not actually, measuring muscle growth. If your set volume is going up, you're obviously increasing your volume load, and that's artificially increasing your volume load in the sense that it's not because you've gotten bigger or stronger, it's because you're doing more work. And the same goes for proximity to failure. If you're just training closer to failure and harder, you are, by virtue of training closer to failure, just training harder, and because you're doing more reps, your volume load goes up. But if you keep your proximity to failure relatively constant, your set volume within a very similar range, and you're comparing your volume load for a given exercise from mesocycle to mesocycle, you're comparing apples to apples. And by doing that, you're actually able to observe if progressive overload has occurred. And this is how we need to look at progressive overload for hypertrophy, very different to strength. For strength, it's am I adding weight to the bar? But for hypertrophy, it's the combination of am I adding weight to the bar? Am I adding reps? And am I able to do a sufficient amount of work at a sufficient proximity to failure and still keep improving with that amount of work? And if so, that's a really good sign as a training proxy for hypertrophy combined with all those other things. And I think the reason why we have so many different variables to assess hypertrophy is because there is no one measure that we can use practically to measure it. So we have to what's called triangulate. So bring about multiple different measurement techniques on the phenomena of muscle growth to help us point in the direction of, are we gaining muscle or not? Mackenzie, I saw you had your hand up before. Is there anything you wanted to add there while you put your lip balm on?
Yeah, there is just one thing that I wanted to add to this.
Your lips look very shiny now. Give us a kiss.
They're very moisturized. Very nicely moisturized now. Yeah, mate. This cold Euro wind is wreaking havoc on me. I tell you what. So back to the introduction of visualized means of assessing progress. So what are we talking about here? Progress photos. Now, I personally think that there are some risks and shortcomings of doing this. Now, the first thing I'll say is I want to preface what I'm about to say and saying I don't work with bodybuilders. The focus is not an appearance thing. You're not scored on how you look. Almost always when I work with someone who's trying to gain muscle, it's for a performance outcome. Okay. Now, the risks of taking progress photos, the first one is that it emphasizes appearance outcomes. And from a psychological perspective, body image, also the connection between body image and eating behaviors, this can raise some potential issues, or that can accumulate over time. The second thing is focusing on what your body does as opposed to how it looks. So the function or functional appreciation may likely, again, have those be a little bit safer, but also might be more, in my opinion, a better idea for consistency and longevity. because you are focusing on something that you can celebrate every single week. If you're seeing progress in the gym, that's something that you can assess quite frequently. Whereas visualization through photos is something that I feel, at least, you're not really going to see a whole lot of change over shorter time periods. And it's more comparing, say, week 1 to week 12 or week 1 to week 20. And that's sort of the time frame you need to see those changes as well. And with that, if we're in a dedicated muscle growth phase, we've already discussed that, once you're beyond sort of that novice phase, you're really looking at wanting a surplus of calories. And when we have a surplus of calories, we do need to accept that there is going to be an accumulation of body fat mass. And whilst we're trying to minimize that, this can throw a bit of a spanner in the works, among other spanners in the works, like lighting, time of day, all these sort of things that can create a conclusion by looking at photos that can be misleading. Or, you've put on muscle, but you've also put on a little bit of fat. So in those photos, do you look like you have gotten more jacked? And I think that is an issue that can be tricky to navigate, even if you have that pragmatic approach, even if you have that really logical coach in your ear saying, no, think about this. If your training performance, your scale weight, it's fine. Don't worry about the photos. I think it's really easy for those thoughts and feelings to play with your head and get you down and mess with your consistency. So for that reason, I'm very hesitant to use visual means of assessing progress. In fact, I will say that I can't remember the last time that I got a client to take progress in photos. But again, we must understand that the clients that I work with are not bodybuilders. They're not they're not going to be scored on how they look. So I guess it's a different kettle of fish. I just wanted to provide that perspective. That's all.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate that. I'll just have one question or rebuttal to that. Obviously, we get people to track their scale weight, and I think that can have a very similar effect to visual photos. Do you not think that it is also a good idea if somebody's experiencing, some of these, potential issues psychologically with taking progress photos, that we should also teach them how to understand those progress photos and to appreciate their body at all certain looks and appearances, just like we do when the scale goes up, and try to get them to be an emotionally robust individual that doesn't experience, all of these negative emotion when they step on a scale or see a visual photo of themselves?
Yeah, 100% think that is a really valid point. And in a lot of ways, we have the same risks when we decide to monitor body weight, as opposed in comparison to when we decide to monitor visual change. But one thing that I've learned over time is that when it comes to nutrition, we don't have solutions. We have trade-offs. Okay. Now we look at the risk of someone. We look at, what's their current relationship with food like? What signs are we getting around body image? Given where this person is currently, is it kind of like weighing themselves and taking photos? Either one. So we're just going to put them in the same sort of basket here. Is that something that is a really risky thing, or do we think the pros outweigh the cons? And I personally think that often in the setting of my clients not being bodybuilders, not being assessed on appearance, I think there is more pros to scale weight monitoring as opposed to image monitoring or like progress photo monitoring. The level of risk associated with either one might be somewhat similar. But like I said, I think there is a larger reward profile on the scale weight trend data as opposed to the visual cues there.
Absolutely. I would agree with your point that 100% scale weight tells you a lot more in terms of the muscle gaining process than the visuals, because the visuals are influenced by so many things. It's very subjective. There's a lot less quantitative, I guess, assessment there. So I agree with that. Yeah, great point. Marta, anything that you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I think this just emphasizes the importance of understanding that the number of variables you choose to track needs to be dependent on the client, and tracking more variables isn't always better. And I think that this can be an issue when, coaches or trainers may have a certain battery of, assessments that they take with new clients. So they got body weight, visual shot, circumference, and so on. And they kind of employ that same battery of assessments with all their clients. So, everyone who comes on board has to take photos, has to weigh in, and they're not, thinking logically about which variables or which assessments are best for this individual client based on their, certain context, their, history, etc. Like Mackenzie said, basically every decision you make will come with a trade-off. And this is why it's important to, sit down and make sure that the variables you're tracking with your clients are individualized, and you're not tracking more than necessary to get the information that you need to make good decisions that keep moving your client forward.
Yeah,
I just think also,
go, mate.
Sorry, I was just going to say that's a fantastic point there, Martin, is just considering what information do you want, and rather than adopting it, throw the kitchen sink at it. I think even the effort cost associated with tracking a lot of things is something that can be a barrier to adherence. So it's like, oh, bro, I want you to track your heart rate. I want you to track your, skin temperature at the morning. And then I want you to track this and all these different things, like just everything under the sun. It's like, okay, what is the benefit to effort cost, not even risk? I think when it comes to why we shouldn't track something, it's not just about risk. And I feel like at this point, we've largely looked at risk, but it's also like, it's a freaking mission and it can distract from things that are more important. So yeah, I think that kind of like, maybe we don't want to call it a minimalistic approach, but just something that is like focusing on those bang for buck things first and foremost, those big rocks, I think is going to give you the best effort cost to reward profile.
Absolutely. I think if we look at the big rocks, it would certainly be scale weight gain over time, as well as training performance increasing in volume load, with other measurements being secondary to that. I'll add that I use visuals differently to, I guess, how they've been described here. I get visuals to compare retrospectively against visuals from a similar phase or at a similar body weight after we've had multiple massing and cutting phases. So what I mean by that is if somebody is, say, 80 kilos and then they do 6 months of gaining, 3 months of dieting down, next time they're at 80 kilos, I'll look at 80 kilos now to how they were 80 kilos 9 months ago. And if muscle has been built, there will be significant differences, or they should be leaner at 80 kilos this time around. So I like to compare body weights across time as opposed to just looking at those visuals independent of and comparing them week to week, if that makes sense. So I'll never get somebody in, say, a massing phase, take visuals weekly or monthly and go, cool, what are we looking like now? It's more so to compare in future. Are you looking better at this body weight over time? Are you looking better at heavier body weights over time? Because if so, that's a really good sign that you've built muscle. What do you reckon of that, Mac?
I reckon that's a doozy way of doing it, because you're eliminating a lot of the noise. You're taking kind of like, it's hard to compare from the start of a mass phase when you've just come off like a shredder bro phase. It's hard to compare that to, 12 months later when you're at the peak of your bulk. It's hard to draw a visual conclusion, and those thoughts and feelings are going to be, running pretty hot. So I think that approach you take, looking at over sort of trying to, cut out the noise, look at face to face, like for like situations, I think has a lot more applicability. In the that's more of a long-term thing, I think. So if you're doing it that way, I can see the purpose behind it. I'm just like, looking at last week's progress photo and looking at it from 7 days later, I think is kind of like, in a lot of settings, at least with the clients that I work, I just don't see any reward to doing that.
It's absolutely something you only use, if you're in a serious fat loss phase with someone who's probably on the very lean side of things, where scale weight fluctuations are going to be running rampant. You won't be able to have good data there. But yes, totally agree on that. Guys, is there anything else that you want to mention as we round up this roundtable? Martin, anything you want to conclude with when it comes to hypertrophy?
Not really. I'd like to hand over to Mac just quickly. So speak to us a little bit more about how nutrition, so we know training performance, drives, or training itself drives the stimulus for hypertrophy. So speak to us a bit about how nutrition can augment our training performance and potentially then influence, the level of stimulus that we can achieve.
Yeah, I'll just try and touch on this as concisely as possible. So I think there's two arms to this. We have the role of nutrition in the muscle protein synthesis side of things. So, training is going to enhance the level of muscle protein synthesis and promote that positive protein balance. But then, protein nutrition, and to a lesser degree, but still a very strong degree, other nutrition factors, in particular, energy balance and calorie intake. Okay. But I think, like I said before, training performance is influenced by nutrition. So it's almost like there's a circle here, like a cycle here. And that is in both ways, or in two ways. We have the effect of nutrition more acutely, or maybe less acutely, but more talking about, having fuel for a productive training session. That's really what I'm getting at here. And that's a product of overall calories. So just calorie intake over time. And then more acutely, we're looking at carbohydrates in the pre-exercise window. We're also looking at hydration because that affects performance as well. But then we've got the other things like caffeine and also comfort. If your guts are frankly not in a good position in your training session, that's going to affect performance. And as a product of that, it's going to affect the training adaptation. But I think there's also another part of the role of nutrition in exercise performance, which is the recovery side of things. If your nutrition is set up in a way where you can recover better and reduce the amount of time needed to, because training is it impairs performance because you are, placing a stress, or you're damaging, in little quotations, the body. And then nutrition plays a role, among other things, in bringing you back up to baseline so you can perform your best. Now, if you can reduce that time frame, it means that you can fit more productive training in less time. And then when we think about the training stimulus, more productive training, greater stimulus, and a greater ability to adapt from that stimulus and recover from it and be better, we're going to see an enhanced training adaptation. So long story short, nutrition, not just about fueling for a fantastic, a fueled up session where you're just, you just got so much energy, you're raring to go, you feel like you've got plenty of fuel on board to perform, but also reducing or minimizing that recovery time so you can fit more productive training in a shorter window, and or even extend the duration of your training cycles and squeeze more volume out of them before having to drop down and do some kind of deload or start a new phase, what have you.
Yeah, I like that. Great summary, Mac. Very good. All right, guys. Well, that was a roundtable for hypertrophy. I hope you guys learned a thing or two, and be sure to check out the lectures, the Q&A, and the articles for more. Mackenzie and Martin, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you all next time.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, gents. Thank you, everyone.